On the 19th of May, 2024, breaking news out of Tehran reported a helicopter crash. The details were hazy, the cause of the crash murky, but one thing was for certain, that a man named Ibrahim Raisi was on board. Raisi was, at that time, the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and we say he was because, well, now we know his fate for certain. Raisi perished in the helicopter crash, one of 8 souls on board, all of whom were lost. It was the highest profile death of a major world leader in the last decade, and one that came at an already critical moment not just for Iran, but for the entire Middle East. In this special episode of WarFronts, we're going to be taking a closer look at the death of Ibrahim Raisi, what went wrong, what happens now in Iran, and what this demise means for the Middle East, and indeed the whole world. For President Raisi, May the 19th would have seemed like any other day in Iran's second highest office. On that day, he was scheduled to have a meeting with the president of Azerbaijan, a man named Ilham Aliyev, in order to inaugurate the Giz-Galasi hydroelectric complex. That complex, basically a massive embankment dam, straddles the Aras River, which in turn defines the international border between Azerbaijan and Iran. On the Iranian side, that's a relatively remote region, some several hundred miles from the capital city of Tehran. To get to the dam, Raisi boarded one in a convoy of 3 Bell 212 model helicopters, a machine estimated to be about 40 or 50 years old. Like the rest of Iran's aircraft, especially Western-made ones like the Bell 212, parts are often in short supply for the aging aircraft on account of international sanctions, and safety checks are often, shall we say, lacking at best. But nonetheless, the helicopter and its 2 counterparts were trusted to get Raisi to the dam, which by all accounts they did quite successfully. On the journey home, Raisi would share his helicopter with several close allies. Also on board the chopper was Iran's foreign minister, a man named Hossein Amir Abdullahian. He held his post since 2021. A representative of Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei was riding alongside them, one Ayatollah Muhammad Ali Hashem. So was Malek Ramati, the governor general of East Azerbaijan province, which is, to be clear, located in Iran, not Azerbaijan. Raisi was joined by the head of his security team, Brigadier General Mohammad Mehdi Mousavi of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. Also on board were 3 members of the flight crew, 2 pilots, each holding the rank of colonel in the Iranian Air Force, and an Iranian Air Force major who was serving as the flight technician. After a successful meeting and dam inauguration ceremony, all 8 loaded into their helicopter to join the convoy en route to the city of Tabriz, where Raisi was due to inaugurate a project at the local oil refinery. But at 13:30 local time, catastrophe struck. The area that the helicopter convoy was supposed to be traveling through had been issued a weather warning the day prior, and conditions on the flight were expected to consist of heavy fog and rain. According to Iranian state media, the pilot of Raisi's helicopter had directed the convoy to climb and pass over a specific nearby cloud, but some 30 seconds later, one of the other helicopter pilots observed that the president's chopper had disappeared. When the crash happened, it took place about 58 kilometers or 36 miles south of the convoy's point of departure, just southwest of a small village called Uzi. News wouldn't break for 2.5 hours in Tehran, but when it did, that news was immediately discouraging. The helicopter carrying President Raisi had been forced to make a hard landing under unclear circumstances, forced down due to weather. Immediately after the crash took place, search operations began to try and locate the president and the other passengers on board. The 2 helicopters that had accompanied Raisi spent some 15 to 20 minutes searching fruitlessly for the crash site before making emergency landings and continuing their search on foot. Rescue teams attempted to make it to the area where the crash was suspected to have taken place, but between the weather conditions and the rugged mountainous local terrain, neither the ground teams nor the people on board the other 2 helicopters were able to locate the crash site. Shortly after the president's helicopter disappeared, the other members of the convoy had been able to contact the downed aircraft, where Ayatollah Ali Hashem, the religious representative of Iran's supreme leader, had also been on board, was able to pick up the phone and confirm that the helicopter had crashed in a valley. In a subsequent call, Ali Hashem had been unable to provide information on any other survivors, quoting a call transcript of Ali Hashem's statements here: "I don't know what happened. I don't know where I am. I'm under trees. I don't know. I don't see anyone. I'm alone." Ali Hashem would continue answering calls for some 3 hours, but he died before rescuers could reach his position. Over the course of the next day, search and rescue parties would struggle through heavy fog to locate the crash site, despite the involvement of some 40 teams dispatched from the Iranian Red Crescent and additional support via unmanned drones. The operation quickly went international, featuring airplanes, helicopters, and personnel sent from Russia, a night vision helicopter, and drone support from Turkey, and rapid satellite mapping from the European Union to aid in the search. The United States, too, received received a request from Iran to help in the search, although a spokesman from the US State Department has claimed that logistical issues prevented the US from actually contributing any meaningful support. Several hours after search operations began, the helicopter was located at an altitude of 2,200 meters, that's 7,200 feet, and the situation was grim. Other than the tail section, the helicopter had been entirely incinerated in the crash, with no survivors at the crash site. By the following day, all 8 bodies had been recovered and transported to the city of Tabriz, and Raisi's death would be publicly confirmed another day after that. Despite Iran's long and adversarial history with a variety of world nations, some of whom have proved particularly adept in the art of assassination, the country was nonetheless quick to rule out foul play in the crash. By all accounts, the crash of Raisi's helicopter was genuinely accidental, and although the precise root cause of the accident is yet to be identified as either mechanical failure, pilot error, or a weather event, or indeed something else, Iran has apparently seen no reason to point a finger at any bad actor. Additional information coming from Turkey has indicated that the helicopter's transponder may either have been turned off or simply not present on board the aircraft in the first place, with either possibility perhaps signaling less than perfect helicopter operation policies among the IRGC. But regardless of the root cause, the overall state of affairs was crystal clear. Iran's president, its foreign minister, a regional governor, and a representative of the supreme leader himself had died, with an entire nation left reeling in the aftermath. The funeral of Ibrahim Raisi was an appropriately somber affair in Tehran, where Supreme Leader Khamenei led tens of thousands of mourners through the rites of a grand funeral. The others killed in the crash were honored there too, in caskets draped with Iranian flags, while on Raisi's coffin had been placed a black turban to signify his direct descent from the bloodline of the Prophet Muhammad. When the ceremony concluded, the Supreme Leader withdrew from the event, and mourners carried the 8 coffins out on their shoulders as crowds outside chanted, "Death to America." The coffins were then brought on a semi-truck for a procession through Tehran, eventually reaching the city's Freedom Square, a site where Raisi himself had given his fair share of public addresses. The funeral saw representatives not from just Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, but the nation's state and non-state allies from around the world, from Russia to China to Iraq, Egypt, Pakistan, Azerbaijan, and Qatar, to even Hezbollah and Hamas. A mourning period was declared to last 5 days, with Raisi eventually laid to rest on Thursday the 23rd. But in order to truly understand what the death of Raisi meant for Iran, we've got to understand the true nature of what Raisi was in life, not just Iran's president, but something more. Raisi was 63 years old at the time of his death, nearly 3 years into a presidential term that began in August of 2021, but by the time he was elected, he had already spent years considered by Western analysts to be both a protege and a potential successor to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei himself. Raisi had studied as a cleric since the age of 15, and he had earned notoriety among the international community while still in his 20s, where his role as Deputy Prosecutor General on a commission that called for the execution of Iranian political prisoners in 1988 earned him the nickname the Butcher of Tehran. He also earned a whole laundry list of accusations of crimes against humanity by the UN, with the full extent of his actions not coming to light until the 2010s. After his butchering days, he served as Iran's Chief Justice, its Attorney General, and as a presidential candidate in an unsuccessful 2017 bid for Iran's highest office, where he lost to a moderate candidate named Hassan Rouhani. When it came time to run again in 2021, the elections that time around were widely considered by international observers to have been rigged in Raisi's favor, as a number of moderators and reformists were barred from participation. During his time in office, Raisi has presided over a wide variety of crises that ranged in their level of severity. On the less catastrophic ends, he oversaw things like Iran's forever stalled nuclear deal with the United States, which was just as dead in the water on the day Raisi died as on the day he took office. He oversaw Iran's relationships with both state and non-state allies across the Middle East, and tried to work Iran through a period of rather intense economic turmoil. Perhaps most defining of his presidency, Raisi would preside over intense unrest surrounding an anti-government protest movement in 2022 following the death of a young woman named Mahsa Amini as a result of police brutality. Raisi also navigated the stormy waters of the Israel-Hamas war, a legacy that Raisi has now left behind after he met his untimely end. Perhaps unsurprisingly, many experts suspect that Raisi's death actually wasn't such an unwelcome news among Iranian civilians, a suspicion that's borne out at least somewhat by the fact that Raisi's funeral proceedings had none of the fire or passion that the Iranian public displayed after the 2020 death of Revolutionary Guard Corps leader Qasem Soleimani. As for whether anyone might have wanted explicitly to see Raisi dead, It's difficult to say. Certainly Israel would be the immediately obvious suspect in any high-profile assassination of an Iranian leader, but again, Iran appears unwilling to entertain the idea that any hidden hand might have caused the crash. If history is any indicator, Iran would be both loath to admit that Israel had carried out a successful presidential assassination on its territory, but at least according to Israel's allies abroad, there's no intelligence to suggest that Israel was behind the incident. Of course, that's all a matter of what Israel's allies are inclined to disclose, but we'll be the first to admit that there is a lot of wiggle room between that metric and what we would define as objective truth. But the fact remains that at least as of right now, there's no indicator that Israel or any other adversary was behind the helicopter crash. But there's one other possibility that we need to consider, that perhaps an act of sabotage was to blame, but one that came from within Iran rather than from without. It would be unusual in such a stable autocracy as Iran for one of Raisi's rivals to think that they could take this sort of shot at him and get away with it. But that's not the only vector from which Raisi could conceivably have come under attack. This is a figure who's widely understood to have been anointed to the Iranian presidency, a clear potential successor to the Ayatollah, but he was also a guy with a whole lot of leverage, courtesy of his public office, and with Iran's behind-the-scenes palace intrigue remaining as notoriously opaque as always, it's not inconceivable that something behind the scenes may have made the Ayatollah and his mullahs regret having allowed Raisi to rise to such prominence. If that were the case, then airplane and helicopter accidents are a tried and true method of, let's say, enemy disposal. Adding to the list of reasons to be suspicious is the aforementioned lack of a signal coming from the helicopter's transponder after the crash, at least according to Turkey. If a transponder was indeed aboard, then someone, for some reason, would need to disable it, and simply trying to hide Raisi's movements for security's sake in his own nation as he travels between scheduled public appearances is not a compelling counterargument. But with this theory too, there are a number of confounding variables to consider, chief among them the fact that Raisi was not the only casualty of the crash. On the one hand, it's easy enough to argue that some of those killed in the crash were close Raisi allies and might have been convenient to take out in one go. Iran's foreign minister and the head of Raisi's security detail would certainly make that list, and taking out all three together could hypothetically have a similar effect to, say, taking out a Wagner Group plane with both the group's military leader and its public figurehead on board. But the leader of East Azerbaijan province, Malek Ramati, is not known to have any meaningful level of political association with Raisi, much less a political alliance, and the Ayatollah who was killed in the assault, Alay Hashem, was a direct representative of the supreme leader himself. Could he have been sacrificed by Khamenei or asked to martyr himself for a broader purpose? Well, technically, it's not impossible, but for Raisi's death to have been arranged in such a way would still be very odd, especially considering that Raisi likely takes plenty of trips airborne where other officials would not be traveling with him. So, as fair as it may be to entertain the possibility that someone somewhere took steps to bring about Raisi's demise in the air that day, that simply doesn't appear to be the likeliest possibility, at least not at this stage. Whether accident or sabotage is ultimately to blame for Ebrahim Raisi's death, the fundamental reality remains the same. Raisi is dead, meaning that the question first and foremost on the minds of all watching from around the world should be, what happens next? With Raisi in particular, that's a question that really comprises two questions. Who is going to be Iran's next president, and who, if not Raisi, is going to be the supreme leader's chosen successor? First, the easy question: identifying Iran's next president. The nation's interim president has already been appointed, a man named Mohammad Makhbar, while Iran's interim foreign minister is Ali Bagheri Khani. Both men are expected to serve for up to a 50-day span in their interim role, by which time Iran will hold a cycle of elections and choose a new president. As of now, that election is scheduled to go down on June the 28th, although that date could conceivably be pushed back between now and then. As for who will run and will ultimately be chosen, it's difficult to say. Raisi was widely expected to coast to at least a second term, and nobody had any clue that he might die prior to election day, unless of course a political rival really was behind the crash. In the upcoming election, Conservative candidate candidates are expected to have the advantage, owing to their alignment with Iran's domestic and international priorities and the general approach that the supreme leader currently favors. In the event that he does intend to campaign for the elected position of president, interim president Mokhber may face an uphill battle in order to get there. Mokhber is widely regarded as more of a technocrat than a populist. He's stayed largely out of the public eye despite his role as first vice president prior to Raisi's death, and he's generally regarded as a caretaker during this sensitive stretch of time, a person that the Ayatollah can trust not to set anything on fire, but not exactly the sort of figure who Khamenei would be looking to partner with for the long term. Now, don't get us wrong, this guy has got credentials, including past roles as the head of several charitable Bonyad organizations within Iran, particularly one that the US Treasury has condemned for systematic land and property confiscations against Iranian dissidents, exiles, and religious minorities. But he's still got the sorts of name recognition problems that have doomed far more promising candidates than him, and while a clear shortlist of potential next presidents has not yet emerged from Tehran, it's unlikely that the shortlist would include only the sorts of names that a guy like Mokhber could leapfrog over. Either way, the issue will be settled within 2 months at the longest, and almost certainly Iran will elect a new face to its highest political office. The country's recent past presidents Hassan Rouhani and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad have long since fallen out of favor with the Ayatollah and aren't expected to have either the political capital or even the will to seek election again. But far harder to answer is the question of who will guide Iran after its current supreme leader eventually dies. By all outward indicators, that day will come sooner than later. Ayatollah Khamenei is age 85 and has long been rumored to be in poor health. With Raisi gone, the next most likely potential successor of the Ayatollah may be his own son, Mujtaba Khamenei, a now 54-year-old cleric who's largely kept to the shadows over the past few years. Mujtaba is a war veteran, having served in the Iran-Iraq War, and he was understood to have played a leading role in the effort to elect Iran's now former president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, as well as to repress public discontent after Ahmadinejad was elected. He was also accused by the former president of embezzling state funds. These days, Mujtaba is a theology teacher and is understood to control significant financial assets on behalf of his family. He also maintains close connections with important figures in the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Even before Raisi's death, it was Mujtaba who'd been seen as the next most likely successor in Iran, and now Mujtaba likely has reason to believe that his way is clear to the mantle of supreme leader. However, experts on Iran tell a different story, suggesting that the cleric elites who run the nation are not inclined to establish a system in which familial lineage is the determining factor to anoint a person as supreme leader. Frankly, plenty of clerics within Iran have Mujtaba beat in just about every critical metric and qualification to be supreme leader, other than, of course, being the current leader's son. And those clerics exist inside a system, the Islamic Republic of Iran, that included among its founding principles the idea that hereditary rule should be abolished. For Mujtaba to become supreme leader would amount to a fundamental violation of that system, even if he were the clear best candidate for the role, which, quite transparently, he isn't. As savvy a political operator as Mujtaba might be, he's not a high-ranking cleric, and under the current system, that should be enough to immediately disqualify him. As for where that leaves Iran, with Mujtaba hypothetically removed or omitted from contention, it's difficult to identify a specific mullah who's most likely to guide Iran into the future. But according to some clerical sources, the Ayatollah himself is firmly opposed to seeing his son become supreme leader, indicating that even if Raisi was Khamenei's prior top pick, there are probably at least a couple of other names on that shortlist. But whether the supreme leader would wish for Mujtaba to butt out or not, the reality of it is that Khamenei will be dead by the time Mujtaba is in a position to cause chaos, and if he chooses to do so, then his connections to the Iranian military could become very important very quickly. If Iran is to avoid that outcome, then something will need to change soon, or else the current supreme leader may die before anything can be done to stop Mujtaba from making his play for authority. So, now that we can step back and examine Iran's new predicament in full view, we're left with one critical question looming above all the others. Will anything change in Iran? And the answer, while rather complex and also nuanced, boils down to a single overarching point: that if things change for Tehran and the nation it oversees, then it'll be because Iran's clerical elites decided to make a change, not as a knee-jerk reaction or an attempt to deal with instability after Raisi's demise. To illustrate the factors at play here, we're going to turn to foreign policy. The death of Raisi, alongside the death of his foreign minister, comes at a time when Iran has been going out of its way to influence the state of affairs across the Middle East. Under Raisi's leadership, Iran has been the primary backer of Yemen's Houthi rebels and their attacks on international maritime shipping in the Red Sea. So too has Iran propped up Lebanon's Hezbollah organization, and both reined in and egged on a range of allied militias in Iraq and Syria. On Raisi's watch, Iran strengthened its ties with Syria's Assad regime while working to influence Iraqi politics and bring the nation more fully under its more powerful neighbor's sway. And perhaps most important of all, while it's unclear just how much Raisi and his allies knew about the Hamas organization's October 7th terror attack before it happened, it's abundantly clear that Raisi and his now deceased foreign minister worked hard to ensure that Hamas could carry on the fight even despite a crushing ongoing counteroffensive by Israel. But while it's undeniably true that Raisi oversaw Iran's actions across the Middle East, it's somewhat more difficult to establish whether those actions were Raisi's own policies or ones where he served as the public face of an effort that would have happened with or without him. Iran's government is fundamentally unlike those of many other world nations. It's strictly authoritarian and relies on a large but closed circle of elites around the supreme leader to make decisions that will guide the nation on its path. The people placed into positions of high political authority are the ones tasked with carrying out Iran's objectives, or at least leading around a sort of dog and pony show for the international community, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the policies they're enacting are ones that they came up with or even that they necessarily agree with. So while it's not inconceivable that the deaths of the president and foreign minister could reveal that Iran's entire international posture over the last few years was their idea, and that with them gone, Iran may fade back into a more neutral or isolationist position, it's also not particularly likely. More plausible is the prospect that Iran's international posture will remain more or less consistent with what it's been for the last few years. After all, it's the supreme leader's take on things that ultimately matters most, and if the Ayatollah was into Iran's current strategic posture when Raisi was in charge, there's little reason to think that that might change now. And indeed, that's the case with all matters in Iran, be they foreign or domestic. When compared to other individual clerics inside Iran, sure, Raisi's office of president conferred on him a certain level of influence that other clerics likely couldn't match on accolades alone. But to presume that Iranian politics work in the same way as, say, American or British politics, with political parties and administrations engaged in a process to shift national policy one way or the other, misunderstands the nature of leadership in this place. Raisi was not a true decision maker. Sure, he could choose whose hands to shake or which factories and dams to visit, but he was powerless to act against the authority of the supreme leader. How much of a leash the supreme leader gives his presidents, we can't really say, and it's reasonable to assume that Raisi and presidents like him would be able to pull the supreme leader in certain directions when it comes to policy. But at the end of the day, Raisi was enacting the will of an authority within Iran that exists on a higher plane than Raisi ever did. And whoever claims the presidency next will have to do the same thing. More likely than not, compliance will be a key factor weighed amongst the Iranian clerical elite when it comes time for them to decide whether or not they'll preordain a result in this particular election cycle. Until that election cycle plays out, Iran is in the lurch, and us along with it. What the supreme leader will ultimately decide for his nation, only he can say, and as usual, the real substance of his decision won't be the sort of thing that he's trying to tell the world about. Instead, we'll simply have to wait with bated breath and continue to read the tea leaves on Iran's internal politics while coming to grips with the reality that when it comes to Iran's place on the world stage, nothing has changed. With or without Ibrahim Raisi, Iran remains at the center of a vast network across the Middle East, and the havoc that Iran's network has wrought thus far amongst the members of its global neighborhood won't be stopping anytime soon.